He told me, right to my face, that one sentence from him could make me disappear. He said it the way people say good morning. Casual. Certain. What he did not know was that my phone was recording every word. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Maya. I was 26 years old when I opened Saffron and Salt, a 40-seat restaurant in a narrow building on a cobblestone street that smelled like rain even in August. It was not a glamorous location. The previous tenant had been a print shop, and the walls still had faint ink stains near the baseboards that I could not fully paint over, so I framed them with thin copper strips and called it industrial character. The kitchen was small enough that I had to turn sideways to pass my sous chef, a quiet man named Tobias, who had worked in hotel kitchens for 12 years and wanted, as he put it, to cook for people who actually looked at their food. I had spent 4 years saving, 2 years planning, and 6 months converting that narrow building into something I was genuinely proud of. The menu was short, 12 dishes. Everything changed with the season. I sourced from 3 farms within 40 kilometers, and I knew the names of the farmers' dogs. That is the kind of restaurant it was. Small, careful, honest. We opened on a Wednesday in early October, which everyone told me was a bad idea. Wednesdays are dead, they said. Open on a Friday. But I had read enough about restaurant openings to know that a quiet Wednesday gives you room to breathe, room to fix things before the weekend crowd arrives. I wanted to earn my first reviews on my own terms, not fight through a packed house on opening night while a line of people waited outside in the cold. The first 3 months were hard, they always are. But by December, something was working. The tables were full on weekends. A few regulars had started appearing midweek. A food blogger with a modest but loyal following had written something kind about our lamb with preserved lemon, and that piece had been shared enough to bring in a new wave of curious diners. I was sleeping 5 hours a night, and I was the happiest I had ever been in my life. That is when Victor Hale walked in. I did not know who he was the first time. That is important. He made a reservation under a different name, which I later discovered was a habit of his, a way of arriving unannounced and anonymous so that restaurants could not perform for him. I respect that in principle. What I do not respect is everything else that followed. He came on a Tuesday, which was our slowest night, and he sat at table 7, the one near the window, with the view of the street. He was a man in his mid-50s with silver hair swept back from his forehead and a posture that communicated, without a single word, that he was accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. He wore a dark coat that he did not remove, and he studied the menu for a long time before ordering. He asked Tobias, who was covering the floor that night, several detailed questions about sourcing and preparation. Tobias answered them well. I watched from the kitchen pass, not because I suspected anything, but because I always watch the room. It is a habit. You learn things. He ate the mushroom broth with smoked butter. He ate the duck with fermented plum. He ate the almond cake with cardamom cream. He did not smile once, but he ate everything, and he ate slowly, which in my experience is the more honest compliment. He left without speaking to me. 2 weeks later, I got an email. It was polite in the way that formal threats are always polite. He introduced himself as Victor Hale, senior food critic at a regional publication called The Table, which I knew by reputation. It was not a national outlet, but in our city, it carried real weight. A positive review in The Table could add 30 covers a week. A negative one could empty you by Friday. Victor Hale had been its chief critic for 11 years, and he wrote with the kind of authority that comes from never having been seriously challenged. The email said he had visited Saffron and Salt and found it, quote, promising but unresolved. He said he was considering a full review but wanted to discuss the restaurant first. He suggested a meeting. He suggested dinner. He suggested, and this is where the email shifted register in a way that made my stomach tighten, that he would be happy to visit again as my guest so that he could experience the full range of the menu in a more relaxed context. As my guest, I read it twice. I showed it to Tobias, who read it once and said quietly that he had heard Victor Hale's name before, not in a good way. I replied the next morning. I thanked him for his visit and his interest. I told him I would be delighted to welcome him back. I gave him our standard reservation details and our current menu. I did not mention the phrase as my guest. I pretended I had not seen it. He replied the same afternoon. This time the email was shorter and the politeness had thinned slightly, like ice in March. He clarified that he had meant a complimentary dinner, as was, he said, customary for critics of his standing. He added that the review he was planning would be, quote, one of the first major pieces on Saffron and Salt, and that such visibility had value. There it was. I sat with that email for a long time. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I think it matters. I felt afraid. Not the sharp fear of something sudden, but the slow, settling fear of understanding that someone with real power had decided to use it against you, and that the decision was already made, and the only variable was whether you would comply or not. I knew what a bad review in The Table could do. I had seen it happen to other restaurants. I had watched a place called Birch and Bone close 8 months after a Hale review described it as aggressively mediocre. The owner, a woman named Diane, who made the best sourdough in the city, had moved back to her hometown and, as far as I knew, had not opened another restaurant. I thought about Diane for a while. Then I replied to Victor Hale. I told him, again very politely, that Saffron and Salt did not offer complimentary meals to critics or to any guests as a matter of policy. I said I believed the integrity of any review depended on the critic experiencing the restaurant as a paying customer, and that I was sure he would agree. I said I looked forward to welcoming him again at his convenience. I pressed send. My hands were not quite steady. His reply came 4 hours later. One sentence. He said he was sorry to hear that, and that he hoped the restaurant would be ready for the attention it was about to receive. I forwarded all 3 emails to a folder I labeled simply Hale. Then I called my friend Priya, who ran a small bistro across the city and had been in the business 5 years longer than me. I told her what had happened. There was a pause on her end. Then she said, with a flatness that told me she was not surprised, he tried the same thing with me 2 years ago. I gave him a free dinner. He still wrote something lukewarm. I spent 6 months wondering what I had done wrong before I realized the review was never about the food. I asked her if she would be willing to put that in writing. She said yes, but she wanted to think about it first. I told her to take her time. I was not in a hurry. Not yet. Victor Hale's review of Saffron and Salt was published on a Thursday morning in February, 4 months after his visit. I had known it was coming. I had seen his name listed in the upcoming features section of the table's newsletter, and I had prepared myself as best I could. I had told Tobias, I had told my front of house manager, a young woman named Cleo, who had the rare gift of remaining calm when everything around her was not. I read it at 6 in the morning, standing in my kitchen at home in my coat because I had not yet turned on the heat. It was devastating. Not in the sense of being factually wrong, which would have been easier to fight, but in the sense of being selectively, surgically true in the worst possible way. He described the space as cramped and the lighting as flattering to the decor, but not to the food. He said the menu showed ambition that occasionally outpaced execution. He called the duck dish, the one that had been on every table all winter, and that people had come back specifically to eat again. Technically competent, but emotionally inert. He described the service as earnest, but inexperienced. He ended by saying that Saffron and Salt was the kind of restaurant that might find its footing given time, but that for now it remained more idea than experience. It was the kind of review that does not shout. It whispers, and the whisper follows you. By that evening, I had 3 cancellations for the weekend. By Friday, 6 more. A table of 8 that had been booked for a birthday dinner called to apologize and said they had seen the review and wanted to try somewhere else. I stood in the dining room after service on Friday night and looked at the tables that would be empty on Saturday, and I felt something I can only describe as a very specific kind of grief. Not for myself exactly. For the restaurant, for the thing I had built carefully and honestly, and was now watching contract under the weight of one man's words. I did not cry. I went to the kitchen, and I checked every station, and I made a list of what needed ordering, and I went home. He came back in March. I did not know he was coming. He made a reservation under yet another name, but Cleo recognized him from a photograph she had found online after the review published, because Cleo is exactly the kind of person who looks things up. She texted me from the host stand while I was in the kitchen. She used 3 words, "He is here." I did not go out immediately. I finished what I was doing. I plated 2 dishes. I checked the temperature on the lamb. Then I took off my apron, washed my hands, and walked into the dining room. He was at table 7 again, same coat, same posture. He was with a woman I did not recognize who was looking at the menu with genuine interest. He was looking at his phone. I went to the table. I introduced myself. I said I was the chef and owner, and I wanted to personally welcome him back. He looked up from his phone with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, but something in between. He said pleasantly that he had heard the lamb was worth trying. I told him it was. I told him I hoped he would enjoy his evening. I smiled. He smiled. It was a perfectly normal 30-second exchange, and I went back to the kitchen and I pressed record on the voice memo app on my phone, which I had set face down on the small shelf near the pass where I always kept it. The shelf where I could see the dining room through the service window. I want to be clear about why I did that. I was not planning anything specific. I was not constructing a trap. I was simply a young woman who had already received 1 threat from this man and was not willing to be caught without evidence a second time. That is all it was. Preparation. The same preparation I used for everything else in that kitchen. Dinner proceeded normally for about an hour. Cleo told me later that he had asked her several questions about the menu changes since the review, and that his tone had been pleasant, almost collegial, as if the review had been a service he had performed rather than a wound he had inflicted. The woman with him seemed to enjoy the food. She had asked for a second helping of the bread, which I noted because people only do that when they mean it. Then, near the end of the meal, he asked Cleo to send me out. I came. I stood at the table. He told me the lamb was excellent. He said the broth had improved since his last visit. He said, and I remember this precisely because I went back and listened to the recording many times afterward, that he thought the restaurant had potential that his review perhaps had not fully captured. I thanked him. I waited. He said he was working on a follow-up piece, a revisit column. He said it could do a great deal to correct the impression left by the first review. He said, and here his voice dropped slightly, that he would of course need to experience the full menu again, ideally over 2 or 3 visits, and that given the collaborative nature of what he was proposing, he assumed the meals would be on the house. I looked at him. He looked at me. The woman with him was looking at the street through the window. I said I appreciated the thought and that I would think about it. He smiled. He said he was glad. He said, and this is the sentence I have replayed more times than I can count. You know, a sentence from me can make a place like this disappear. He said it the way you might say the weather is turning. He said it with the complete confidence of a man who had never been wrong about his own importance. I said, I understand, thank you for coming in. I paid for his dinner myself. I wrote it as a business expense. I went back to the kitchen and I finished service and I did not say a word to anyone until the last dish was clean and the last light was off and Tobias and Cleo had gone home. Then I sat at table 7 with my phone and I listened to the recording. It was all there, every word. I sent the file to my email immediately. I uploaded it to a cloud drive. I texted a copy to Tobias with a message that said, keep this safe, I will explain tomorrow. Then I sat in my empty restaurant for a while, in the dark, at the table where Victor Hale had just told me he could erase me, and I thought about what I was going to do. The answer came together slowly over the next 2 weeks. Not as a plan exactly, more as a series of conversations that kept pointing in the same direction. I called Priya again. I told her about the recording. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I want in. She also told me about a chef named Marcus who ran a seafood place in the north of the city, and who had a story about Victor Hale that she thought I should hear. I called Marcus. He told me that Hale had visited his restaurant 2 years prior, had demanded a complimentary tasting menu for himself and 3 guests, had been refused, and had subsequently published a review that called the restaurant's fish sourcing questionable, a claim Marcus had been unable to fully disprove publicly because Hale had never specified what he meant. The review had cost Marcus a catering contract with a local hotel that had been close to signing. He had the email chain. He had kept everything. I asked Marcus if he would be willing to speak publicly. He said he had been waiting for someone to ask. Then there was the matter of the food festival. Every spring, our city hosts a 3-day food and hospitality festival called Plate, which brings together chefs, restaurateurs, critics, food writers, and industry professionals for panels, tastings, and demonstrations. Victor Hale was a regular presence. He moderated panels, he gave brief talks. He was, at the festival, what he was everywhere else, the authority in the room. This year, I had been invited to speak on a panel called New Voices in Independent Dining. It was a modest slot, a 40-minute conversation with 3 other young restaurant owners, scheduled for the Saturday afternoon of the festival in the main hall. When I received the invitation in January, I had been pleased, but not especially excited. After everything that had happened with Hale, I called the festival coordinator and asked a few questions about the format. She told me the panel was recorded and live-streamed, that it typically drew an audience of 200 to 300 in the hall and several hundred more online. I told her I was looking forward to it. I asked if there was any flexibility in the panel topics. She said the conversation was meant to be candid and that the moderator encouraged honest discussion of the challenges facing independent restaurants. I said that was wonderful. I said I had some thoughts on that. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing, not the way I prepare a menu with instinct and iteration, but the way I imagine a lawyer prepares a case. I organized everything into a single document. The emails from Victor Hale, the recording from March, Priya's written account of her experience, signed and dated, Marcus's email chain, and his written statement. I also contacted 2 other restaurateurs whose names had come up in conversations with Priya and Marcus, a woman named Soo Jin, who ran a Korean fusion restaurant, and a man named Gerhard, who had closed his bistro the previous year. Both had stories. Both were willing to share them. Soo Jin agreed to attend the festival panel in person and speak if the moment arose. Gerhard sent a written statement that I printed and brought with me. I also contacted the editor of the table. This was the part I thought about longest. I did not want to go to the editor as a complaint. I did not want to seem like a restaurant owner with a grievance, which is exactly how it would be dismissed. Instead, I wrote a careful email in which I described myself as someone with information relevant to the editorial integrity of the publication. I attached the emails and a transcript of the recording. I did not attach the recording itself, not yet. I said I was making myself available to discuss the matter and that I intended to speak about my experience publicly at the Plate Festival in 2 weeks. The editor called me the next morning. Her name was Renata, and she was not what I expected. She was direct, and she was clearly uncomfortable, which told me she was not entirely surprised. She asked me several careful questions. She asked me to send the recording. I sent it. She thanked me and said she would be in touch. She also said, almost as an aside, that she had received similar concerns from other sources in the past, but had never had documentation. I told her she had it now. The week before the festival, I heard from Cleo that Victor Hale had made a reservation for the Saturday of the festival weekend, not at Saffron and Salt, at a well-regarded brasserie 2 streets from the festival venue, the kind of place where industry people gathered during Plate to see and be seen. He was not attending the festival itself, as far as I knew, but he would be nearby. He would hear about things. That was fine. That was actually fine. The morning of the panel, I woke at 5. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table and I read through my notes one more time, not because I needed them, but because the ritual of it steadied me. I had the printed document in a folder. I had my phone with the recording saved in 3 places. I had Priya's number on speed dial, and I had confirmed with Sujin that she would be in the audience. I dressed carefully, not in chef's whites, which would have been a costume, in a dark green dress that I had bought for my restaurant's opening night and had not worn since. I looked in the mirror for a long time. I did not look like someone who was about to do something dramatic. I looked like a young woman going to a professional event. That was exactly right. The festival hall smelled like espresso and fresh bread and the particular kind of nervous energy that comes from a room full of people who care deeply about food and are also, in various ways, competing with each other. I found the panel room, checked in with the coordinator, and met the other 3 panelists. A young man named Felix, who had opened a vegan tasting menu restaurant, a woman named Adeyeze, who ran a Nigerian-influenced cafe, and a quietly intense person named Sam, who operated a supper club out of a converted warehouse. They were all interesting. Under other circumstances, I would have wanted to talk to them for hours. The moderator was a food journalist named Clara, who I had met once before at a different event and liked. She had done her research. She opened the panel by asking each of us to describe the biggest unexpected challenge of running an independent restaurant. Felix talked about supply chains. Adeyaz talked about the difficulty of educating diners about a cuisine they approached with preconceptions. Sam talked about licensing. I talked about power. Not in those words, not immediately. I said that one of the challenges I had not anticipated was navigating relationships with people whose professional role gave them influence over a restaurant's survival, and that I had come to believe the industry needed to talk more honestly about how that influence was sometimes misused. The room shifted slightly. Clara looked at me with an expression that told me she was paying close attention. She asked me to say more, so I did. I described the emails. I did not name Victor Hale immediately. I described the pattern. The initial visit, the request for complimentary treatment framed as customary, the refusal, the subsequent negative review. I described how the review had affected the restaurant. I described the second visit, the renewed request, and the sentence that had been said at the table. I said, he told me that one sentence from him could make a place like mine disappear. The room was very quiet. Clara asked if I had documentation. I said I had the emails, which I was happy to share. I said I also had an audio recording of the conversation at the table, which I had made on my phone and which captured the exchange clearly. Someone in the audience made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a laugh. I said I was not the only person with this kind of experience. I said I had spoken with other restaurant owners in our city who had encountered similar situations with the same individual. I said Priya Menon, the owner of Jardine Bistro, had provided a written account of her experience. I said Marcus Webb of Webb Seafood had documentation of a similar exchange. I said Sujin Park of Hangang Kitchen was in the audience and was willing to speak. Sujin stood up from her seat in the 3rd row. She did not say much. She said, everything Maya has described matches my experience exactly. She said it clearly, and she sat back down. I said the individual I was describing was Victor Hale, senior critic at the table. I said his name once, clearly, and then I stopped. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then the room began to move. I should describe what happened in those next minutes carefully, because I think it matters to be accurate. There was no dramatic moment of collective outrage. There was no single reaction. What happened was more like a tide shifting. People were looking at their phones. People were leaning toward each other and speaking quietly. The panel moderator, Clara, handled it with real skill. She did not let the conversation collapse into chaos. She asked me a few more questions, asked Sujin to elaborate briefly, and then, with a calm that I admired enormously, steered the conversation toward a broader discussion of accountability structures in food criticism and the vulnerability of independent restaurants to reputational harm from individuals with outsized influence. The panel ran 15 minutes over its scheduled time. No one left. Afterward, in the corridor outside the hall, I stood with Priya, who had watched the live stream from her restaurant's office and called me the moment it ended. She said, "You did it exactly right." I said I had just told the truth. She said, "Yes, and you had proof. That is the difference." My phone had 17 messages. Several were from journalists. One was from Renata, the editor of The Table. She said she needed to speak with me as soon as possible. She said the situation was developing quickly on their end. I replied that I was available. Victor Hale's response came not through any official channel, but through a message to my restaurant's general email, which Cleo forwarded to me that evening. It was long and it was, in its way, extraordinary. He accused me of fabricating a narrative to damage his reputation. He said the recording was taken out of context. He said the emails had been mischaracterized. He said he had been a champion of independent restaurants for over a decade, and that my accusations were a calculated attack by someone who had been unable to accept honest criticism of her work. He said he intended to pursue legal remedies. I read it once. I forwarded it to my folder labeled Hale. I did not reply. 2 days later, The Table published a statement. It said the publication had been made aware of serious concerns regarding the professional conduct of one of its contributors. It said an internal review had been conducted. It said Victor Hale's column was being suspended, pending the outcome of that review. It thanked readers for their patience. The statement used the word suspended. That word did a lot of work. Over the following 2 weeks, 3 other restaurant owners came forward publicly with accounts of similar experiences with Victor Hale. One of them I had never spoken to. She had seen the panel live stream and recognized, as she put it, the exact conversation she had been afraid to talk about for 4 years. Her account included a voicemail she had saved in which Hale's tone was unmistakable. The table did not reinstate Victor Hale's column. They announced 6 weeks after the festival that he was no longer with the publication. The announcement was brief and contained no praise, which is how you know it was serious. Publications always find something to praise when the departure is clean. Hale posted a long statement on his personal website. He called himself the victim of a coordinated smear campaign by disgruntled restaurateurs who could not accept professional criticism. He said the food industry had a culture of grievance that was becoming dangerous to honest journalism. He said he would continue to write independently. He has written 4 pieces since then, all published on his own website. The most recent one received 43 views, according to the counter at the bottom of the page. I know this because Cleo checked. I want to tell you what happened at Saffron and Salt. The weekend after the festival panel, we were fully booked for the first time since the February review. I assumed it was curiosity, the kind of attention that follows any public moment, and that it would fade. Some of it did fade, but not all of it. What stayed was different from what had been there before. The people who started coming to Saffron and Salt after the festival were not coming because of a trend or a moment. They were coming because they had heard about a young chef who had refused to be intimidated, and they were curious about the food that had been worth fighting for. They came and they ate, and many of them came back, not because of anything I had said on a panel, but because the lamb was good, and the broth had improved, and the almond cake with cardamom cream was, as it had always been, exactly what it was supposed to be. We added 4 covers in the spring by rearranging the layout near the window. Tobias hired a second line cook, a young woman named Bee, who had just graduated from culinary school and who moved through the kitchen with a focused quiet that reminded me of myself at her age. Cleo redesigned the reservation system so that we could track returning guests and remember their preferences. Small things, concrete things, the kind of improvements that come from stability rather than survival. I still have the folder labeled Hale on my phone. I have not deleted it, not because I need it anymore, but because it contains, among the emails and the recording and the statements, a record of something I want to remember clearly. Not the threat, not the fear, but the specific moment, sitting alone at table 7 in the dark after he had left, when I decided not to comply and not to collapse and not to wait for someone else to fix it. I decided to prepare. That is all. I prepared the way I prepare a dish I have never made before, carefully, without rushing, with attention to every detail, and with the understanding that the work itself is the point, not the applause at the end. Table 7 is still my favorite table in the restaurant. It has the best view of the street. On quiet Tuesday evenings, when the service slows, and the kitchen hums at a lower register, and the light through the window turns the kind of amber that only happens in late autumn, I sometimes stand near the pass and look at that table and think about what it means to build something honest in a world that occasionally sends someone through the door to test whether you mean it. I mean it. The copper strips around the old ink stains on the baseboards have darkened slightly with age. They look better now than they did on opening day. Some things do. Victor Hale once told me that a single sentence from him could make me disappear. He was right that sentences have power. He was wrong about whose sentences mattered. The last time I checked, Saffron and Salt had a 4-month waiting list for weekend tables. We do not offer complimentary meals to anyone. Our menu still has 12 dishes. Everything still changes with the season. I still know the names of the farmers' dogs.